And now, I think kind of a strange transition, but it is one that sort of continues. I think hopefully give you a little window into sort of the genealogy of what I read as a young person and how that affected me as a writer and what has really given me the impetus for the things that I write. And I think in that section that about from Drift, where you see Robert's fascination with Nazis and with the war and with history in general, is very close to my own experience. And it wasn't very long before I figured out that I wanted to be a historian, in fact, and actually studied history as an undergraduate, and that's what I majored in before I decided to go into literature. And so this book, Day of the Dead, is actually kind of a prequel. My first novel was called Crossing, and I wrote that here at Ohio State, actually, in 1989, when I was a student here in the creative writing program. And it was a novel based on a real story that had affected me fairly deeply I think I read it when I was maybe 20 years old. It happened when I was about 20, in El Paso, Texas, in which a group of undocumented workers who had paid a coyote, which is a labor smuggler, money to bring them into the U.S., had been abandoned in a railroad car that had been set off on a little used track. And it didn't take very long for these men, there were 13 of them, to suffocate to death. But there had been one survivor who had managed to take a railroad spike and dig a little hole in the bottom of the floor through which he could get enough air. And so when I came, that story struck with me, and this was around the time that I was really kind of deciding that I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to do it seriously. Jim Phelan, who's a professor here still, and was one of my very first and most important mentors, actually came to San Antonio in 1988 to recruit. They were looking for Latino students from Ohio State. And my teacher, one of my professors there, who, because I was a double major in history and English, came to me and said, you should go and talk to this guy. He's from Ohio State. I know you decided to go to law school. I was already admitted to UT Law School, and I was dead set on becoming a lawyer because being a lawyer was important, and I was a first-generation college student. And my grandmother had died just before I entered into college, and that had affected me greatly, and I wanted to do something important. The last thing she did before she passed away was to bequeath me her small house on the west side of San Antonio, which probably wasn't worth more than $24,000, but it allowed me to rent it out and then give the proceeds to my mother, and freed me from feeling the burden of having to support or help support the family, allowed me to go to college and do well. And so all through college, my motivating factor, one of them, a strong motivating factor, was to do well and to go to law school and do something that my grandmother would be proud of. And so I was there. I was ready to join the ranks of the legal community. And Jim Phelan came by, and I went and saw him. And he asked me, "What do you really like to do?" Because I guess he got a vibe that I wasn't really all that ecstatic about going to law school. And I said, "Well, I tinker around with stories. I write stories from time to time." And he said, "Well, why don't you give me a couple of those?" And he said, "I'm going to be here all afternoon. I'm interviewing other students. Go back to your dorm room and bring me a couple of stories. Let me take a look at them." So I thought, well, what the heck? I'll do it. So I came back a couple hours later with 2 or 3 stories that at this point I'd be red-faced to read again. They were probably really terrible. But they were all about broken-hearted young men whose fathers had left. I guess I haven't strayed that far from that. But in any case, I brought them back to Jim, and it could have been more than 3 or 4 weeks later, I got a letter in my dorm room saying that they would give me a full ride here at Ohio State to come study creative writing. And I thought, I can put law school off for a year. I can defer and see what happens. And I came to Ohio State and never looked back. And in that year, I began to write Crossing, and I think that story stuck with me because even though I did not in any way, shape, or form suffer the kind of deprivations that these migrant workers did, the idea of leaving home for the first time, of migrating in a sense up north, of taking the very same, a very similar route to what my grandparents and my father, who was also a migrant worker in his youth, had taken to pick crops and tomatoes and strawberries and corn, all the way up through Michigan and back. Really kind of connected me to this idea of what would force or what would compel someone to leave everything that they know and just strike off on their own. And when I did it, it was a very important moment in my life, as many of you left home to come to school can relate to. But for me, it was especially burdensome because my family, I still felt, was fairly rudderless, and I was the eldest, and here I was leaving them behind. I felt a great, tremendous responsibility for them. And here I was coming to Ohio State, and that story began to resonate with me. This idea of, I wanted to explore the idea of why people leave. Why do they go on to the unknown? Why do they face these risks? And of course, my risk was the same. I wasn't going to come back in a box. But this idea of leaving and being alone and feeling alienated and coming to the Midwest, and this was somebody that had never lived outside of Texas, who'd never seen snow. San Antonio, about the coldest it gets is 50 degrees. Today, my mom would be, she'd have a parka on. I mean, so cold weather was foreign to me, and I can remember coming here and going, oh my God, this is horrible. Everything was white. The people were white. The culture was white. The snow was white. I was the only brown person in Columbus, it seemed like to me. And so I just felt very different. It was the first time I'd ever actually had to think about being Mexican American or being Latino, because in the West Side, you can go your entire life on the West Side of San Antonio not having to learn to speak English, and here I was in a very alien culture to me. And so when I started writing that book, I could relate to this young man. And so one of the main characters in Crossing is an older man named Berto Morales, who is on this railroad car track with the young narrator. And as they begin to face the fact that they are not going to get out of this boxcar alive, the old man begins to open up to this young man and tell him that he has something very serious to confess, and that he has to confess to someone because he doesn't want to die with this on his conscience. And so he goes on to talk about a couple of murders that he took part in. And in one of the sort of these moments in which he's confessing this, there's a short section, very short section, probably only 2 or 3 sentences, in which he says, "And I searched for the murderer of my wife over those next 10 years, and never found them. And I had always thought to myself, I'm going to eventually go back and write that book. That's going to be a novel, because I was more interested in Berto's background, but it didn't fit into the structure of my first novel. So this Day of the Dead is, in fact, this book that I sort of put off writing for almost 15, 16 years. It kind of just always sat in my head, and I actually wrote it in between two novels that had taken me a very long time to write. One of them taking me 3 years, and the other one was going on its 3rd or 4th year of writing. And so, as a kind of break, or so, I was in this writers' conference, writers' retreat. I had about a month, and I wrote the first draft in 2 weeks. I mean, I sat and wrote 35 pages a night, 35, 40 pages, and it just came out completely. And it's never happened before. But so what I have here is Day of the Dead, and that's sort of the genesis of this book. Here, it's fairly self-explanatory. Berto Morales talking about this search for the killers of his pregnant wife. He comes home to find his wife dead in the year 1912, and this novel takes place between Day of the Dead in 1912 and 1913, which is the height of the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, in which it became incredibly chaotic, in which no one really knew what side anybody was on. There were 5 or 6 different regimes in place, generals fighting each other, all claiming the mantle of the people, and there's just widespread slaughter. It also involved 2 million dispossessed people coming to the United States. So this was a beginning of an immigration from Mexico to the United States that was very heavy. And so that was also interesting to me. Where did my people come from? And so this was a part of my exploring not only Berto's journey, but also my grandmother's story. Where did her people come from? Because there were these sort of faded stories about the past and how they'd gotten into the U.S. and why and how. And so this was also part, I think, of me trying to uncover that. And so this section opens the book. It's called Invocation.